Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters. That's what it says on the title screen. Don't at me, you dorks. Is that how that's how people communicate? They at people? Okay, cool. SNK's first shot against Capcom's Street Fighter II and a long line of shots between the two future rivals of the fighting game arena. Fatal Fury tells the story of two young men and their buddy Joe competing in a tournament for the right to face off against the man who killed their father, Keith Howard. The game was your typical fighting fare, pick a character, learn some special moves, beat everyone along the way, etc., but had a couple features that made it unique, notably a plane switching mechanic that allowed you to switch between background and foreground layers to dodge attacks and change attack strategies. It also allowed a second player to join in and partake in 2-on-1 handicap matches against the computer, essentially a precursor to the dramatic battle things in those Street Fighter Alpha things. And then nothing happened. Okay, something happened, but whatever. Fatal Fury would eventually get ported over to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System courtesy of Takara in 1993, a year after Street Fighter II would get its own port on the system, and the end result is not quite stellar. You do have all the fighters, the three main players, all the bosses, but the game's missing the 2-on-1 multiplayer mode as well as the plane switching feature of the Neo Geo original, which were things that made Fatal Fury special. No pun intended. You take these things away and you're left with an otherwise mediocre fighting game on the Super Nintendo that doesn't play very well. Oh, it's missing the arm wrestling bonus game, and they replaced it with this thing where you knee bouncing tires, and if you miss one you still get a perfect win. Also, I think the scoring is kind of broken because every time I start a new game, the score wouldn't reset to 0 until I turn the system off. And yes, this is a legit copy of the game. I'm not using emulation or effort drives or any of that shit. Fatal Fury offers two modes of play, a single-player championship mode, which is your standard arcade mode, and the usual two-player versus mode, where player 1 can pick any of the three main players, Terry, Andy, or Joe, while player 2 can not only pick the main players, but also any of the bosses, which seems like an extreme handicap to an otherwise standard two-player mode, except player 2's bosses are missing some moves, including basic ones such as throwing or jumping, which is funny because the CPU-controlled fighters can do these things just fine and then some, and your basic controls are as follows: the Y button punches, the B button kicks, and the A button throws. Without the game's plane switching mechanic to complement, you're left with a somewhat simplistic button configuration that you could change if you like in the options, but one that could work if done right. Unfortunately, control is hampered by poor response time, resulting in even the simple special move command of jumping diagonally to be delayed somewhat, leaving you open for your opponent to attack. If you manage to nail the timing on the commands, you could pull off some special moves with some semblance of regularity, but it's still a very tall order, and the basic fighting mechanics are simply too basic to be anything special on its own. You could argue those are the woes of playing a fighting game with a stock SNES gamepad, but Street Fighter II hit the system a year earlier and had more responsive controls, regardless of whether you were using the gamepad or the super pad or whatever pad you had on hand. And you know what, it's a bit of a shame too, because Fatal Fury is actually quite charming in its arcade mode. The bosses you fight have some unique quirks to them. The short old man who transforms into a big hulking old man mid-fight. Billy Kane loses his stick and he covers up until someone from the crowd tosses him another one and the fight continues. And there's a couple that will use their environment to their advantage. Those are nice little touches that I like, and they make the fights a little more interesting and a step above the typical fighting game fare. Kind of thing I'd wish they bring back if they haven't already done so. I haven't really checked, but chances are they probably won't because esports and shit. Okay, whatever. Fatal Fury is not a bad looking game. Yes, it's somewhat downgraded from its Neo Geo original, some missing details here and there, the unique intermissions between matches replaced with this one stock Keith Howard shot, but it's still a perfectly fine looking fighter. I like that some stages have transitions between rounds that depict the passage of time. Round 1 could take place during the day, Round 2 during dusk, Round 3 at night. Neat little detail that I appreciate being retained on some stages. The characters look fine, the mugshots are fine, animation is kinda jank at times, but no worse than other SNES fighting fare at the time, so it's not that big of a deal. Sound has seen a bit of a downgrade. There's significantly fewer voice bites to be found here, and the few that made the transition, along with some of the sound effects, have a bit of a muffled quality to them. The music has also been drastically undercut in the transition. What was once a varied and diverse collection of tracks for a fighting game has been reduced to melodies played on the simplest of instruments, one of which may very well be a church organ. I'll admit that I don't actually mind the tracks as they are. There's a certain charm to the church organ-backed tracks, but these are not the best takes on some classic tunes. Overall, Fatal Fury on the Super Nintendo is mediocre fare. And I say that without comparing it to the Neo Geo version, which further reveals a port that's missing a few bits that made the original version unique. Poor control response, a gimped 2-player mode, and waiting are the main culprits that takes this King of Fighters down a notch or two, holding back what could have been a perfectly fine little fighter on the SNES. In its favor, Fatal Fury has enough quality to it that it doesn't quite fall into the SNES fighting dreck occupied by rubbish such as Doomsday Warrior or Street Combat, but that's not exactly high praise either. All in all, anyone wanting to see where SNK's fighting follies all began should stick with the Neo Geo or equivalent emulated versions that you could find just about anywhere these days, and steer clear of this lesser SNES port. And even on the SNES side of things, there are much better fighters you could be playing.
Geez, Howard fell from a high-rise building. He died in a hospital 3 hours later. Except not really. Because they keep putting him in games.